being in our class tonight. If I get someone to close those doors for us, please, we'll get started. There's always a little bit of hustle and bustle outside, so we can kind of cut down on that a little bit so the rest of us can maybe focus a little bit better. Tonight we're going to be looking at the story of the Good Samaritan. I doubt if there's a single person in this room who's not heard this story before. Is there anybody who's never heard the story of the Good Samaritan? That's kind of what I thought. That's part of my challenge. Because you're so familiar with the story. You see, the story of the Good Samaritan is so familiar to us, we kind of use it as an expression to talk to people who maybe are compassionate, people who show some kind of sacrificial action towards someone else, and we'll call them a Good Samaritan. As a matter of fact, for most of us, if we are called a Good Samaritan, how would you look upon that? Would you look upon that as an insult or a compliment? So you see, that's the way we are now. I mean, the story is so familiar to us, and this is a part of the problem I have. Because the story is so familiar to us, most of us think we know it. Right? Right? Most of us think we know it. Well, I'm not sure we do or not. Because I want to talk about something tonight in the story of the Good Samaritan that those of us who are as adults need to take the next step. You see, the story that was told to us over there was a wonderful story. They did a great job with it, just like last night. Wonderful job. Young people, little children, others learned some good lessons. But those of us who are as adults need to take another step. We need to go a little deeper, if you will, into the text, into the story to see what it is. What is it that Jesus is really teaching? Is he saying to those of us who are believers and Christians, here's how you're supposed to behave? Is that really what the story is about? Or is it about something else? Verse 25. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? That's where the story begins. You see, the story's not told to believers. The story was never told to people who were at a VBS who all believed in the Lord. It was told to people who didn't. And was told for the purpose to say to a man who asked the question. By the way, if you notice, he wasn't sincere about it. Verse 25 says he tested the Lord. He wasn't necessarily sincere, I guess. Maybe he was partly, but I'm not sure completely. But he asked this question, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Let me ask you a question now. Why are you here? Think about it. Why are you here? Are you here because you want to know what it takes to inherit eternal life? Are you here for your kids? Are you not interested in heaven? You're not interested in the Lord, but you want your kids to know the Lord? I mean, I'm not questioning your motive here, because I say to parents all the time, if you're not interested in heaven, at least give your children the opportunity. How many of you grew up like I did? I grew up down in the southwest part of Tennessee. Born in 1950, went to a little country school. Every morning we started school with reciting the Lord's Prayer. Any of you ever do that? You remember that? We recited the Lord's Prayer, and then we said the Pledge of Allegiance every single day. You see, you know what my teachers taught me that my parents never taught me? They taught me how to pray. Now, you know what the sad part is now that we've taken prayer out of school? I wonder how many children in our country today don't even know how to pray. And if you think that's not a big deal, reflect on your own life and think about the time when you needed to pray. And you were taught by someone along the line how to pray. See, we don't think about those things. But the time's going to come, and in this little baby's life right here, as cute as she is, she's going to face some problems where she's going to be so overwhelmed. She's going to need help from somebody other than anybody on earth. And that's God. And at that moment is when she's going to either say, I know how to pray, or I don't. It's a sad commentary in our world. What must I do to inherit eternal life? Probably the greatest question ever asked. Think about all the questions in the world that have been asked from the beginning. All the inquisitive minds seeking and looking and trying to understand more and more. But the single greatest question ever asked by humankind, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Verse 26. Jesus gives him an answer. But he answers with a question. Great way to teach. He says, what's written in the law? Well, he answers. How do you read it? Verse 27. He says, well, love God with all your heart, with all your soul. Love God with all your mind and with all your strength. And the second one's like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. Now, look, this guy's an expert in the law. He knows what the law says. So the answer he gives is an answer that's correct. And the answer he gives, it's an answer that all Jews would have given. You see, what he gives here is what's called in the Hebrew the Shema. It's taken, if you have a Bible and you want to open it up there, look in your center reference, you probably will see the reference is to Deuteronomy chapter 6, right? Deuteronomy chapter 6, 4 through 6. That's called the Shema. Every Jew recited the Shema twice a day because that's how many times they were required to pray. And you always quoted the Shema before you prayed. So every Jew knew this passage, and they knew what the answer was. That was the greatest commandment of all. Love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and then Luke adds, and with all your strength. Mark does the same thing in his passage. Matthew doesn't do that, but we'll save that for a little later on. And so he says that you do this, and then he says, the passage says to us that basically love your neighbors yourself, verse 28. Jesus says you've answered correctly. Do this and you will live. Text tells us that this command, love God and love your neighbor, and all this fulfills the prophets and the law. The reason why it said that is because it's the summation. To love God and to love your neighbor sums up all of God's laws. What it does is it speaks to us and it says to us, there are only two things that you need to focus on in life. You and God, and you and others. That's it. Think about the Ten Commandments. Ten Commandments found in the book of Exodus. Everybody knows the Ten Commandments, right? You know the Ten Commandments can be broken down into two parts. First part deals with God. First commandment is what? You shall have no other gods before me. The sixth command deals with me. He says, you shall not covet, you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery. You see, you have the first set of the commands and the first 10 commandments dealing with God. The second part of the 10 commandments dealing with our relationship with each other. That's all we have to focus on. I mean, it's not that complicated. It's not really all that difficult to comprehend. And so Jesus says to this man, you know what? You've answered right. Exactly. It's at this point where the man has a problem. It's at this point where he should have said, love God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength, and to love your neighbors yourself. I can't do that. I can't love God perfectly. I can't love my neighbor like I love myself. I don't have the ability. I don't have the capacity. And he should have thrown himself on the mercy of God. But you know what he does next verse? He wanted to justify himself. You see that? He says, Notice what he does here too. I want you to see, catch this. He skips over the part of loving God. You see that? He doesn't even talk about loving God. You know what he talks about? Who is my neighbor? So as far as he's concerned, I'm loving God like I ought to. I think I'm doing a pretty good job loving God. Maybe it's my neighbor I might have a little problem with. After all, he's not the best neighbor in the world. He comes over sometimes and tries to take stuff out of my garden. So I'm not sure I do a good job with him. Maybe we ought to talk about who's my neighbor. And that's where the parable picks up. Now, let me say this. Starting in verse 30, going through verse 37, is a story. It's not something that really happened. It's a story that Jesus tells to illustrate a point. Now, I want to teach you something about parables here. Parables are told to make one point. That's all they do. They make one point. Now, people pull a lot of different points out of parables, especially the parable of the Good Samaritan. I mean, if you read some of the stuff out there, it goes on and on and on about the lessons you can learn about the Good Samaritan. But a parable only teaches one point. That's why I don't have an outline. There's only one point in this parable, but it's a powerful point. It's a point that everybody who ever draws a breath needs to consider. So here's what he said. Let's read now, starting in verse 30, Tony. In reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was. And when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to the man and bandaged his wounds, pouring oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. "Look out for him," he said, "and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have." Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? The expert in the law replied, "The one who had mercy on him." Jesus told him, "Go and do likewise." All right, let's back up now and look at verse 30. Jesus starts out the story here, and he tells us the story of this man. Obviously, I say obviously, the Lord doesn't tell this, but I understand it, at least in my mind, the man who is robbed and beaten is a Jew. He's coming from Jerusalem, so it makes natural sense that he would naturally be a Jew coming out of Jerusalem. The Bible tells us here that he's going down to Jericho. Now, if you ever have the opportunity to go to the Bible lands, to visit Israel, please go. Please go. You say it's too dangerous. I'd rather be in Israel than New York City any day. It's as safe or safer than New York City, certainly. But if you ever get the chance and opportunity to go, go. It's like a friend of mine says, you can go to heaven without going to Israel. But it's like the difference in watching a black and white TV and a color TV. You get the same story, but it just has a lot more meaning to it. The geography from Jerusalem down to Jericho is tremendous. There's a 4,000-foot drop from Jerusalem down to Jericho. Jerusalem is about 3,000 feet above sea level. Jericho is 1,000 feet below sea level. 17 miles. I mean, you talking about having a bang on a motorcycle, you folks who like to ride motorcycles, take your motorcycle over there and ride. But it's just like this. It's a dangerous road. If you've ever been to Pikes Peak and driven up Pikes Peak, you kind of get a sense of what it's like. You're looking down constantly thinking, oh man, we're going to fall off this thing. So here's this man, he's going down to Jericho. And it's a road that's known for danger. It's a place, as a matter of fact, it's called the Bloody Pass because there's so much violence. All of us know that there are certain places in Nashville that you don't want to be in at night, right? Well, certainly that's the truth here. Going down from Jerusalem down to Jericho would be the case. So he's going down, and he's attacked. Now notice the text tells us here that when he is attacked, verse 31, he's going down the road and he saw the man. Well, I'm sorry, I'm back up in verse 30 is where I need to be, Tony. He's attacked, and it says that he is not only attacked, he's also stripped of his clothing. I noticed they didn't do that over there. I'm glad they didn't. But he's stripped of his clothing. I take that to mean he was naked. He's beaten. The word for beaten there is a word which means to a pulp. It's a word in its verb, in its tense, mean they continually beat him. And so he's bloodied, he's broken, he's beaten, he's naked, and they rob him. I mean, it's one thing to rob somebody, but then to beat him like they did and to strip him of all his clothing, I assume they took his clothing too. And then it says that there's a man that comes down. The first guy that comes down, it says, is a priest. Now, a priest would have known the Old Testament, right? He would have known what the Old Testament teaches. Did you know that the Old Testament teaches that you treat strangers kindly? As a matter of fact, in the law of Moses in the book of Exodus, it says that if you see a stranger's donkey in a ditch, you're to help him get that donkey out of the ditch. Well, what about the man? Surely too. The Old Testament nowhere, anywhere, sanctions the idea of mistreating anyone. But this priest sees this man. Now, in the original, you can't see this in the English, but in the original language, there's an unusual phrase that's used twice in this story, and it's the only place it's used in the Gospel of Luke. It says he went by on the other side. Now, in the Greek, the word that is used is the word anti. You catch that word. You know that word from other places. It means the opposite. So this guy didn't just walk by and happen to glance down and look at him. He went out of his way all the way over the other side, the opposite side, to walk by him. And he goes by. And then he tells us that there was a Levite that came by. Now the Levites are from the tribe of Levi. And the tribe of Levi is where the priests come from, but it's also the place where the Levites come from. The Levites are the assistants to the priest in the temple. While they're not on the level of the priest, they are certainly people who know the Old Testament, familiar with the Old Testament. They were basically the police in the temple, sergeant of arms, if you will, in the temple. They kept order. They made sure that that all the things that they were supposed to go through in the process of all that went smoothly, and all that went on. And that's what the Levites did. And so he goes by, and he sees the man who is beaten, and the Bible tells us that he too goes by on the opposite side. Both men very religious. Both men would claim that they are men of God, men who follow the Old Testament, or at least follow God, but who don't get involved. Being religious isn't going to get you into the kingdom of heaven. You understand what I'm talking about? Just attending church on Sunday. Even those of us who might believe we are attending the right church, it's not going to get you into heaven. Basically, what the priest and the Levites say is, I'm not going to get involved. Don't count on me. I'm not going to participate. I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to be religious. I'm going to maintain my religiosity. I'll sit in my same seat every week. I'll give my contribution the same amount every week. I'll be back the next week, Lord willing, if I'm not providentially hindered. And I'm expecting my place in the eternal kingdom. Verse 33. It says, but a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was. And when he saw him, he took pity on him. Now, you have to really understand, I know we got a little inkling of it over there. We may not understand the background of why the Jews and Samaritans hated each other so much. It was a racial issue is what it was. In between the Old and New Testament times, actually during the latter part of the Old Testament, when the northern kingdom fell, the Syrians took the people back to their capital, and they repopulated. They left some of the Jews there, the poor ones, the uneducated, the people like that, the crippled, so on and so forth, the sick. And they repopulated. That's the way they did things in those days. They repopulated that area with Gentiles. And the Gentiles and the Jews that were left intermarried. And there arose this half-breed Jewish race known as the Samaritans. Now, for us, that's not a big deal. My younger son his wife gave him for Christmas this thing called DNA, where you slobber in this jar, and then they tell you where you're from. Have you ever done that? Well, he got this DNA test, and he got it back. And we were looking at it. I knew his mother, of course, she's from Ireland. I know it because she's so hard-headed. But her last name too. but anyways, he gets this DNA back, and it has all these places where, it says he's from and all that. And I thought, man, that's pretty neat. I might try that one of these days, but I haven't done it yet. But for the Jews, DNA, if it came outside of the Jewish race, that's it. It's over for you, buddy. For them, the purity of the bloodline was what it was all about. If you didn't keep the bloodline pure, you were doomed. How many of you read the Old Testament when you started out and the first thing you came across was one of those genealogies? With all those long names, hard to pronounce, and so you just kind of skipped over it. Why are all those genealogies in the Old Testament? Because those folks see, or at least they saw the importance of keeping their race pure. That's what they wanted. Well, Samaritans weren't pure. When the Jews are allowed to go back and rebuild the city of Jerusalem and rebuild the temple, the Samaritans come down. You can read about this in the book of Ezra and the book of Nehemiah. It's found in both those books. The Samaritans come down, they say to the Jews, hey, we'd like to help you rebuild the temple. And the Jews say, no way, Jose. We're not going to let you be a part of this. And they got really upset about it. And they got quite mad about that. And they became very antagonistic against the Jews and trying to prevent them from rebuilding the temple. So there's a lot of animosity between the Samaritans and the Jews. Matter of fact, I want you to take now in your mind, your geography of our state of Tennessee. I want you to take the state of Tennessee. You think about it this way, horizontal. Now I want you to think about it vertical. Let's say up here we have Knoxville and what we call East Tennessee. And in the middle we have what we know as Nashville and Middle Tennessee. And then down here in the bottom we have Memphis and West Tennessee. Now basically what you have is Israel. That's how Israel is in the time of Jesus. The bottom part would represent Jerusalem. The top part would represent Galilee. The middle part represents Samaria. As a Jew, if you're down here in the bottom part of Memphis and you want to go to Knoxville, you go through Kentucky because you would not cross into Middle Tennessee. That's what makes John's gospel so interesting when he tells us that Jesus goes through Samaria and he meets a woman at the well. That's an interesting comment there. But that's how much the Jews hated the Samaritans. So here's this Samaritan. He comes along. And it tells us in verse 33, when he gets there, he passes, verse 33, he gets there as he travels, he sees this man, and he takes pity on him. And that's where it all begins. And he went to him, and he bandaged his wounds. Interesting word. The word wounds there is the word trauma. We get our word trauma from that word. Pouring out oil and wine. And the word pouring there is a word which means not to dabble. He didn't just take a little wine and touch the wounds. He soaked the wounds. He poured it over the wounds so that the flesh and the wounds could be softened where they could heal easier. Then it says he took the man and he put him on his donkey. Now other translations read the word beast, but it could be a donkey, it could be a mule, it could be another kind of animal, but it was a domesticated animal that he had. And it says he brought him to the inn and took care of him. Now notice verse 35, Tony. The next day. That's what I want you to see. The next day. What I get from that is that he took the man to the inn, but he didn't just drop him off and say, you take care of him until I get back. What he did was he took the man to the inn and took care of him that night and saw to it that he was comfortable and that he was being taken care of. Now, inns in those days are not like inns today. It probably was a grass mat on a dirt floor, and he had water and some food. That was about it. But still, he took care of him. And then the next day, when he gets ready to leave, it says he gave the innkeeper 2 denarii. Now, let me stop there, because a denarii for us is not something we talk about. The equivalent of 2 denarii here for the rate of what it was in those days to stay in a place, you're talking about 64 days. This is the equivalent of 64 days of rent for the man to stay. This is not something that just, I'm going to take care of you today, tomorrow you're on your own. He gives him a generous amount of money here for the man to stay and take care of him. And then he not only does that, he says after all that, he says, now if there's anything that I need to pay you when I get back, I'll do so. So he kind of left himself open there. A lot of businessmen would say that's not a smart thing to do, but that's what he did. And then it says that he said to him in verse 35, look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. Now, I forgot. They told me I got to quit at 10 till. I apologize. Okay, I got to wrap it up right here. What's the story about? That's what I want to get to. What's the story about? Here's what it's about. There's not a single person, or at least I'm going to say for myself, I cannot love God with all my heart, with all my soul, with all my mind, and with all my strength like I want to. I can't do it. It's frustrating. It's challenging. And I can't love others the way I love myself. See, Jesus was saying to this man, what must I do to inherit eternal life? You know what the answer is? You can't. There's nothing that you can do that you deserve eternal life. I got to quit. Thank you all very much. We have refreshments out in the breezeway if you'd like to go get some.